Hi everyone, Professor King here. Today I'm going to be talking about the excerpt from Foucault's Panopticism, which is a chapter in his book Discipline and Punish. So I will be talking about that particularly within the context of visual arguments. And I'll pull up the notes right here so that if any of you are struggling with this, I know this is probably one of the more challenging readings in the class, that at least we have kind of a structure or a setup that to follow so that these questions can guide us. So I'm going to put it on the share screen here, and then I will be talking about these different elements. Like I said, this kind of gives the structure of what to anticipate as you're reading Foucault. So if you read it once and you were like, I have no idea what's going on, definitely go back, give it a second read, because it's short. I mean, I know it's dense, but it's short. It's only about 10 pages. And go back and kind of review according to these bullet pointed questions or things to consider that I'm talking about. But first things first, before you even do the reading, if you haven't yet read the argument the chapter on from Everything's an Argument on Visual Arguments, there we go. You'll want to do that first, because a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here in terms of the notes and how to approach Foucault has to do with what to anticipate in terms of a visual argument. So if you haven't read that chapter yet, in most versions it's chapter 14. You might have a different version where it's different, but look at the chapter on visual arguments and consider the following. First off, Foucault starts off by talking about the daily life at the end of the 17th century in Europe, where the second plague epidemic had just hit. The first one being the Black Plague of the 14th century. So a lot of us, we tend to think of ourselves as very unique in what's going on right now in terms of COVID-19, but actually Western society and many societies have seen any number of epidemics that have wiped out major populations. I mean, anyone who has any native heritage in the United States is going, hi, yeah, we know all about a plague, right? So, there's always the hubris of societies that consider themselves technologically advanced in thinking that, oh, we have all this technology, we should have transcended this by now, right? That's exactly what it is a hubris, right? It's a sort of Achilles heel of arrogant pride, we'll say. And we're experiencing that right now in our day-to-day lives. But anyway, we go back to the 17th century in Europe, where they had experienced the second of what they historically saw as three major plagues, right? So this is the second one after the Black Plague. And Foucault sets this up as discussing, ta-da, quarantine, right? He's talking about how people responded, how societies, individual households, communities, towns, districts, how they responded both on the individual level and on the institutional level to this plague. So, maybe some insights we can make, right? But what I want you to focus on thinking about visual arguments is, again, you probably will want to read it twice. And so when you go back and read it the second time and you really visualize what you're reading as far as what goes on in these houses, in these towns, in these districts, with the quarantining and the exiling and all the other things that happen to people who are living during this time of plague, right? And who are responding to, the fear of loss of life, just like we are today. How their lives are sort of managed is fascinating. And that description that he shares is fascinating. So, and it's definitely a visual argument. Again, if just to backtrack a little bit, Foucault and his name is Michel Foucault, French guy. So that's how you pronounce it. He's not around anymore, but he was at one point, and he was a really wild individual. If you ever get a chance to read a biography of Michel Foucault's life, I highly recommend it, because the dude was into all kinds of wild stuff. And, you know, arguably one of the most brilliant theoretical minds of the 20th century. Anyway, I digress. But what he was part of was this theoretical movement known as New Historicism. And you don't really have to know anything about this, but I just want you to understand why he's talking about what he is. New Historicism is a way of re-looking at history, a lot of times through a literary lens, but not always. Re-looking at history in ways that we hadn't looked at it before, okay? So some of you might be reading this going, why the heck is this weird French guy using all these wacky words and talking about the second plague in the 17th century in Europe, right? Like, what is this? But what he's doing is, you know, just as historians do, he's looking at this moment in history in a way that it hadn't been looked at before, to sort of start to talk about, right, discipline and punish, right? What we might refer to as carceral behaviors. You hear that word a lot right now in terms of like the prison industrial complex and stuff, but carceral behaviors, right? And so that's why he's talking about this stuff. And so when we start to think about this, he's starting in communities, right? He's describing homes, home life, town life, right? So that's you know, that's crazy to think of. So I want you to if you've read it already, go back and reread it and imagine that daily life, right? That he talks about with this new historical lens, right? But go to those scenes in those first few pages that he's describing and just imagine you're a fly on the wall. You know, a fly that has a vaccine, right? But imagine you're a fly on the wall and you're seeing all of these things that Foucault describes. I want you to really absorb kind of what feelings come up for you when he describes how the houses are, how people are managed, right? How towns are managed, how districts are managed, right? Visualize them. Think about, again, not just your intellectual response, but your emotional response. Because, right, he is implying an argument. One of the things about new historicists is they know that the way that we discuss history is an argument in and of itself, right? And we see that, you know, this sort of idea of like, to the victor go the spoils when we're talking about history. In other words, you know, it's the side that wins that gets to tell the story. The side that conquers, I guess, is probably a better word, not wins, as opposed to the side that has been conquered, right? Those voices kind of get silenced and shushed. So if that's the case, then there are so many histories that we're not hearing, right? There are so many arguments and voices and approaches and perspectives that we're not hearing. And so new historicists want to go back and say, well, let's consider it from perhaps one of those lenses or from a totally radical new lens, like let's have a fresh contemporary reading of this old thing, right? So think about those scenes, and then kind of once he gets to around page 199, he starts talking about lepers, right? Because again, we're in the plague, right? And so we have lepers and not leopards, right? There's not like cute little runny cats running around. Lepers, people who have been infected with the plague and are in essence dying, but are also contagious, right? So he talks about the exile of the lepers. Exile, you know, for those of you who need a little refresher, it's to be kind of sent away from society, right? Away from one particular society to another, or just away from society in general. There were, you know, one of the most famous leper colonies I can think of is in New York. They had an island where I believe it was for tuberculosis, if I'm not mistaken, at the beginning of the 20th century. They would send anyone who was sick to that island to just essentially go and die. And in the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 90s, they started sending the bodies of all the unclaimed victims of AIDS to that same island. So I'll remember the name eventually, but this idea of like being exiled, right? Being sent away, right? So the lepers are sent away. And why? What about that, right? Why? And what about the division between the normal and the abnormal? So we've got this discussion of these towns, how things are managed during a pandemic, the way that normal and abnormal starts to be, you know, very much divided, right? And how we deal with it, exiling of lepers, all of this stuff plays into one another, right? And think about, I mean, I don't even have to say it, but think about what's going on today, right? Think about the way that we are responding to people who have tested positive for COVID. Think about the ways, you know, that we treat patients. I'm sure some of you have read some of those horror stories, right? Think about the ways in which we sort of, you know, attempt surveillance on one another. Like go on Instagram for 10 minutes right now, and you will see something calling out or policing, right? Somebody on some aspect of this pandemic, right? So think about all of that in terms of the division between the normal and the abnormal, between the criminal, the so-called criminal, right, and the non-criminal. And that segues into his discussion of Jeremy Bentham's notion of the panopticon. So just a little side note on Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was an economist out of Oxford, yeah. And Jeremy Bentham is still encased in wax, and his waxed corpse resides over certain meetings. It's a whole weird story, but you don't have to know that, but it's just a cool story. So there's a Jeremy Bentham's corpse that is literally like sustained inside of airtight glass, and the parts that have decayed are waxed up, still sits in England, because he was like this super famous economist, and he had like these, you know, all kinds of wild ideas. Very, very brilliant guy. So Bentham, this guy Bentham, who Foucault is looking at, who he's, you know, again, Bentham has this argument, Foucault responds to it with his own argument. Now we're reading Foucault, and we're going to respond with our own argument. Bentham talks about this phenomenon known as the panopticon, and it's a tool of incarceration, right? There are a few images that I put in the PDF that you'll want to look at. They're black and white, so if they're a little difficult to see, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm saying this, but yes, if you want to Google panopticon images, it'll give you an idea of what Foucault describes, a visual rendering of what he describes, right? And I don't want to give too much of it away because you got to do the reading. But what I would say is read Foucault's description. Again, if you got to read it twice or 3 times, a lady, do that. Or, you know, if you got to read it and look at some of those photos to kind of get a visual. I know the first time I read it, that was the first thing I did, right? It was like, what in the heck does this thing look like? Because if people describe instructions to me, I don't know where to go, but if I can see a picture of it, I get it, right? So look at those images, right? Think about where the guard is situated, because it's essentially, one thing I will say is it's a prison, right? Think of where the guards are situated. Think of where the prisoners are situated. Think of the visual nature of the panopticon, not just stepping back and seeing the whole thing, how it operates, but that is incredibly important. But also, who in the panopticon can see whom? And who can't see others? And why might that be important when we're talking about the separation between the normal and the abnormal, when we're talking about disciplining and punishing certain sectors of our population? You know, when we're talking about living in quarantine, right? All of these sorts of things. What visual argument does this panopticon create, right? make sure based on what Foucault talks about, you understand what it is. Well, I already kind of gave that away, but what it is, the purpose it serves, right? And again, like why? Why is it structured the way that it is? Who benefits and who does not benefit? Who is clearly not benefiting from this institutional structure, this literal institutional structure? Like it is a building, right? And who is benefiting? And lastly, and this is the most important one, and I want your brains to go bananas with this question. If this panopticon that Foucault's talking about is sort of a visual metaphor, a visual argument for what we see in society since then, you know, since the 1600s, since the late 17th century, what is it a metaphor for? What's it an argument for? Are there different panopticons? Panopticons? Are there different panopticons that exist perhaps today? And what are they? And where do we see them? And again, who are the seen? Who are the ones who are not seen? Who, if we think about this in terms of power dynamics, who has power, who does not? And why is that? What purpose does it serve? What function does it serve? So consider all of these things, again, either as you read Foucault for the first time or as you reread Foucault, because I remember when I read this, and again, it wasn't easy. It was a struggle for me. I was like, right? But I remember reading this and just, right? Like it blew me away. And some of you may read it, you know, and be like, this is BS, right? There are plenty of theorists out there. And this is what's great about argument. Foucault's not, you know, it's persuasion, it's not proof absolute, like we've said since Leith, right? Foucault could be wrong. And people like Camille Paglia, who's still alive, who's another very famous theorist, they hate Foucault. They think he's full of it. But it's an argument, right? It's an argument, and you can believe it, you can disbelieve it, you can kind of be somewhere in the middle. And that's what's great about all of this stuff, right? You don't, just because you understand it does not mean you have to agree with it. But it's just another cool idea, or maybe not so cool idea, that, you know, somebody with some credence, some credentials, some bona fides, right, is sharing with us. So I hope this was helpful. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day. I'll see you all in cyberspace. Okay, bye.